open up, and unfortunately, we heard some news of a number of soldiers that were unfortunately killed yesterday. So we're going to open up with our Tefilat that our learning should be a zechut for all of our chayalim and for the return of our chatufim, and bring nechama to all of those who have been impacted by this war, and that God should, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, should give guidance to our leaders to make the right decisions. Okay, so we are now, after taking a few-week hiatus, where we talked a little bit about Inyane Diyoma, had been talking about Chanukah and last week Asara B'Tevet. We're now going back to our regularly scheduled programming, where we've been dealing with issues connected to Tefilah, and we've been focusing specifically recently on the development of Tefilah. And what I wanted to do today, last time we had discussed this, we had talked about the concept of davening 3 times a day, where that comes from, and the significance behind that. What I want to do today is focus on the status of Tefilat Arvit, what we call generally Mariv, because there's a very interesting and fascinating discussion, regarding the status of Arvit, Mariv, whether or not it is an obligation or it is actually optional, and it begins in the Gemara, and then the discussion continues all the way through until the status of Mariv today in the modern day poskim. So we'll start with the main source, which is a Gemara in Brachot, and the Gemara in Brachot in source number 1 begins by quoting the Mishnah. The Mishnah is discussing the timing of how long you have to daven the various tefillot, and the Mishnah ends with the phrase Tefilat ha'erev ein la keva. That's the beginning here of source number 1, that the evening tefillah has no set. Doesn't say what, set what. So asks the Gemara, my ein la keva, what do you mean? What does the Mishnah mean when it says that the Mariv tefillah has no set? Says the Gemara, ilema di'i ba'i matzli kule laila. If what the Mishnah wanted to say was to say that a person can daven Mariv all night, Lisnei Tefilat ha'erev kol laila, you could have said that very easily. You didn't have to give a vague phrase like ein la keva, there's no set. The Mishnah should have simply said, you can daven all night. Tefilat ha'erev kol laila. Says the Gemara, ela mai ein la keva. There must be a different meaning to the Mishnah. The Mishnah must mean something else when it says Tefilat ha'erev ein la keva. What does it actually mean? Says the Gemara, kiman de amar Tefilat arvit reshut. That this Mishnah must be according to the opinion that says that davening Mariv is not an obligation, but rather is optional. Reshut meaning you permitted to do so. It's an optional thing. It's not something that you're obligated to do. Reshut, as opposed to, as we're going to see, the language of chovah. Okay? The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and it quotes Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Tefilat Arvit, Mariv, Rabbi Gamliel Omer Chova, for Rabbi Yoshua Omer Reshut. Rabbi Gamliel says it says that it is Chova, it is an obligation to daven Mariv, and Rabbi Yoshua says it is permissible. It is permission, it is an optional, is the best way to say it. Yes, you're pointing out that the language of Ein La Keva, is not so clear. What they're saying by Ein La Keva means it's not fixed, it's not determined, it's not mandatory. Rather, according to this interpretation, if that's what the Mishnah meant when it said Ein La Keva, you're right, it is a funnier phrase. What they're basically saying is Ein La Keva means that it is not mandatory, it's not fixed, but it's rather something that you can do if you want to. That's what you'd have to interpret the language, the meaning of the Mishnah to mean. That's what the Gemara initially thought it meant, and then the Gemara says no, because you could have said that much more easily. Yes, correct. You are correct. And you're right. You are correct that is what the Mishnah was talking about. But then the Gemara determines that that's not what the Mishnah actually means. And the conclusion of the Gemara seems to be that this is according to the opinion that says that it's a reshut, it's optional. And then the Gemara goes on to quote a number of opinions regarding this question. So here it quotes a machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Gamliel says that davening Mariv is obligatory. Rabbi Yoshua says it's optional. The Gemara continues, Amar Abaye, Halacha kedivrei haomer chova. Abaye claims that we paskin that it is obligatory. Rava Amar, Halacha kedivrei haomer reshut. Rava says we paskin that it is actually optional. And then the Gemara goes on and quotes a fascinating story. This I don't want to spend too much time on this story, but I want to read this story because it's connected to what we're talking about, and it actually is the beginning of a well-known story in the Gemara that's connected to this specific topic. The Gemara tells a story regarding the machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua on this specific topic. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ma'aseh b'talmid echad, sheba lifnei Rabbi Yoshua. There was once a student who came in front of Rabbi Yoshua. Amar lo, he asked him, Tefilat Arvit, Reshut o Chova? Is it obligatory or is it optional? Amar le Reshut. He responded by saying it's optional. Ba lifnei Rabbi Gamliel. They then approached Rabbi Gamliel, who at the time was the head of the yeshiva. Amar lo, Tefilat Arvit, Reshut o Chova. They asked Rabbi Gamliel the same question. Is it Reshut? Is it optional or is it obligatory? Amar lo Chova. Rabbi Gamliel said, of course it's Chova. It's obligatory. Amar lo, said the student. This guy was a little rabble rouser. V'alo Rabbi Yoshua omer Amar li Reshut. What, your student, your Rabbi Yoshua, who's a part of this yeshiva, he told me it was optional. Amar, Rabbi Gamliel couldn't believe it. Amar lo, he said, Hamtein ad sheyichdesu ba'alei trisin lebeit midrash. I'm going to wait until the tough guys, ba'alei trisin are the tough guys, the tough characters enter the beit midrash, and then I'm going to challenge Rabbi Yoshua on this issue. Kishenichnesu ba'alei trisim, when the tough people entered the beit midrash, Amad hashoel v'sha'al, that same student who was creating problems, got up in the beit midrash and asked the following question. I want to know, Tefilat Arvit Reshut o Chova? Is Arvit Reshut, is it obligatory or is it optional? Amar lo Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel responded, Chova, it is absolutely obligatory. Then Rabbi Gamliel got up and said, and turned, Amar lo Rabbi Gamliel to l'chachamim, he turns to the beit midrash of Klum yesh adam shecholek b'davar. Is there anyone here in the crowd who disagrees with me? And who obviously was in the crowd at the time? Rabbi Yoshua, okay? Amar le Rabbi Yoshua lav. Rabbi Yoshua says, no, everyone agrees with you, which we know, obviously, was a little bit not correct. Amar lo, so Rabbi Gamliel then turns to Rabbi Yoshua and says, V'halo mishimcha, amru li reshut. But I heard in your name from somebody else that you actually are telling people that it's optional. Amar le Yehoshua amod al raglecha v'ya'idu b'cha. Rabbi Yoshua, get up, stand on your feet, and tell us what you believe. What is it? What do you believe? It's reshut or it's chova? Amad Rabbi Yoshua al raglavi. Amar Rabbi Yoshua got up and said, Ilmale anichai v'humet yachol achai lachish etamet. If that student who created the problem was no longer alive, then I could deny that I ever said anything because I'm living. He's alive. He's no longer alive, and I could claim that I never said that it was reshut. Achshav she'ani chai v'hu chai, heichan yachol achai lachish et achai. Now that we're both alive, how could I basically? I must tell the truth. I cannot tell a lie. I'm the one who said that it was reshut. So Rabbi Yoshua is admitting now in front of the whole Beit Midrash to Rabbi Gamliel, who is the head of the yeshiva, that he went against or he disagreed with Rabbi Gamliel. Hayar Rabbi Gamliel Yoshev v'doresh Rabbi Yoshua omed al raglav ad shuranenu kol ha'am v'amru lechutzpit targaman amod v'amad. Rabbi Gamliel then continued to give a drasha. He basically ignored Rabbi Yoshua, who was forced to stand in the corner almost, as it were. I don't know if it was actually in the corner. And he made Yoshua stand there while he gave a drasha. It was almost a way of punishing Rabbi Yoshua for disagreeing with him. And the Gemara goes on. We're not going to do it again. I don't want to focus on this too much, but the Gemara goes on to this. Actually, this event was the eventual cause of Rabbi Gamliel being replaced as the head of the yeshiva, which is a very well-known story. They replaced him with somebody by the name of Elazar ben Azariah, who was too young for the job, but then overnight, we know the famous story that what happened to him was his beard turned white in order to make him appear more appropriate. And it actually becomes a fascinating debate because Elazar ben Azariah was a much more amenable type of personality as opposed to Rabbi Gamliel, who was a much tougher personality. And there's a fascinating conversation regarding styles, leadership styles. Elazar ben Azariah opened up the Beit Midrash to anyone who wanted to come in. Rabbi Gamliel was much more discerning in who he let into his yeshiva, because he wanted to make sure that it was going to be only a cadre of excellent students. Which educational method is better? Those who let anyone into the Beit Midrash who wants to come in, or those who believe in creating an elite that are going to continue the future of OUisrael? So it was a fascinating conversation, and it's a fascinating story. And it all started from this discussion, from this conversation regarding the status of Mariv, of Arvit, whether Arvit is Reshut or it is Chova. So I didn't get it. Basically, what happened was, thank you. No, yeah, you're right. I didn't translate that last part. What happened was that Rabbi Gamliel forced Rabbi Yoshua to be standing there as he's giving the drush, and eventually the crowd got up and said to Chutzpit, the Meturgaman, the person who was translating, and said to him, "This can't continue. This can't continue. We can't allow Rabbi Yoshua to be embarrassed like this. He's just standing there." Like he's, kind of the image I have. I don't know if it's like the guy standing with the dunce cap in the corner, right? He's just standing there while you're giving the drasha, and then they say this isn't the first time this has happened. There's other times where he has challenged Rabbi Yoshua, and then a group of people approach and the idea to replace Rabbi Gamliel as the head of the yeshiva gains traction, and eventually Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah then becomes the head of the yeshiva. So again, I brought it because I think it's just a fascinating thing to be aware of, and it's really a wonderful story, and has many ramifications for educational styles and leadership styles. But for our purposes, what we see from here is we have this machlokes. It's clearly a machloket that began with the Tanaim, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Gamliel. It continues through Abaye and Rava, who are the Amoraim, and there's clearly a big debate here whether or not Mariv is obligatory or it is optional. But then there's another Gemara that mentions this as well. The Gemara in source number 2 quotes discusses a similar type of situation, a question regarding the status of Mariv, and it quotes that Rav, who is also again another one of the seemingly the Amoraim, who paskins that Mariv is a reshut. I'll read the Gemara quickly. I don't want to get into the details of the context too, because it's a little bit complicated. But Amar Rav, source number 2, Tefilat ne'ilah poteret et shel Arvit. If a person davens ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, he is now patur, he is exempt from davening Mariv that night. I don't want to get too much into the details of why that would be. But Rav basically Damar Rav, Damar Tzlosa Yesera. This was an extra davening. V'keva detzali le'lusot sulo tzarich. Once he already davened, Ne'ilah is usually davened towards the evening time. And once you daven in the evening, you no longer need to daven Mariv. That's Rav. Asks the Gemara, wait a second. But the implication that if you daven Ne'ilah, you're patur, you're exempt from davening Mariv, implies that if you didn't daven Ne'ilah, then davening Mariv would be an obligation. So says the Gemara, Umi Amar Rav Hachi, are you implying that Rav holds that davening Mariv is actually an obligation? Veha Amar Rav, but Rav we know elsewhere says, Halacha kedivrei haomer, Tefilat Arvit Reshut. Rav elsewhere paskins that davening Mariv is a reshut, is not an obligation. It's optional. Answers the Gemara, Ledivrei haomer chova kamar. He himself believes that it is optional. He was talking according to the opinion that believed that it was obligatory. Okay, but what we see from this Gemara as well is that Rav clearly paskins that Mariv is a reshut, and the Rishonim discuss and point out that if you were to take these two Gemaras, the seemingly implication would be that we would paskin that Mariv is reshut. Why? Number one, because in source number 1, that was how the Gemara explains the Mishnah. The Mishnah now is according to the opinion that says reshut. And number 2, based on general halachot, rules of psak, when we have a machlokas between Abaye and Rava, we generally will paskin like Rava, and Rav, we generally paskin like Rav as well. So because of the people involved here, the implication seems to be that we're paskining that Mariv is reshut. The problem is that if you look at a number of other Gemaras, the Gemara seems to indicate otherwise. And that's where we have now a number of Gemaras, which we're going to do. We'll do them. We'll go through them because they're each making a similar point, but they're all pointing out that seem to imply, at least at face value, that Mariv is actually an obligation and not a reshut, which would go against what we just saw in the first 2 Gemaras. Yes.
Just as a trailer, could you just review where the idea of Mariv came from? In other words, they're debating whether we should or not. Where did
Excellent. Okay, so the idea of where Mariv came from, which we're going to see also on the continuation, that we've done in the past, but the simple understanding is that, and this is part of the conversation, but the simple understanding of where Mariv came from, at least the earliest source would be the Gemara that says that it came from the Avot. Okay, that would be the earliest source. The idea that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each of them established one of the different tefillot, and the Gemara that we saw earlier that says that Yaakov was one who was mitakein Arvit. That's the Gemara. The Gemara also connects it to the korbanot, although in the korbanot it's a little bit different, because in the korbanot you only have 2 korbanot that are korban tamid, and then the third one, Mariv, is said to refer to the burning of the limbs of the korbanot that continued to happen through the night, and that corresponds to Mariv. Those are, again, according to the Gemara, are those the sources for davening Mariv, or are those just hints to the idea of davening Mariv? That's not clear, okay? But there is this idea that Mariv, that is where Mariv seems to have come from. And then the Chazal established it as 3 times a day, but the main sources are those 2 places, okay? But as we're going to see soon, there will be a difference between those 2. And we'll see why that's going to be important. Okay, so now the question becomes whether or not this is obligatory or not. So now let's continue our Gemara. We have a few more Gemaras that now seem to indicate that it actually is obligatory and not optional. What do we see? That's source number 3. The Gemara in Brachos discusses the following scenario. What happens if a person forgets to daven mincha, or a person forgets to daven mariv? So the Gemara says the following. Ibailuhu. Ask the following question. Ta'a v'lo hitpalel mincha. Let's say a person forgot, or for whatever reason, he was unable to daven mincha. Mahu sheyitpalel arvit shtayim. Should he daven mariv twice? So im tim salomar ta'a v'lo hitpalel arvit mitpalel shacharit shtayim. Says the Gemara. Well, one thing we know for sure is that if you forget mariv, you should daven shacharis twice. Says the Gemara, that makes sense. Why does that make sense? Because if we know that the halachically, the Jewish day begins at night, so it would make sense that if I forget at mariv, I can continue and make it up in shacharit, because shacharit is really a continuation of mariv, of the night before. Says the Gemara, but maybe if I miss mincha already belongs to the day before. Mariv belongs to the next day. So ask the Gemara, maybe I shouldn't be able to make up mincha at mariv because I've now crossed over to the second day. Answers the Gemara, no, you can. You can, even though mariv is already the next day, you can still make up Tefilat mincha from the day before if for whatever reason you missed mincha. All the Rishonim point out. Why is that? Because again, even though they're separate days, nevertheless you're able to make up a tefillah that you missed at the next tefillah, even if it's halachically the next day. All the Rishonim point out that the implication of this Gemara, the idea that if I miss mariv, what do I need to do? Make it up the next day. What does that seem to clearly indicate? That mariv is an obligation, because if mariv is just a reshut, if mariv is optional, if I missed it, I missed it. Not only is it a big deal if I miss it, I don't have to do it to begin with. So all the Rishonim point out that, wait a second, something here doesn't fit in. So that's Gemara number one, that they say this seems to clearly indicate that mariv is a chova. Source number 4, another discussion, a similar type of discussion. Amar Rav Anan, Amar Rav. Rav Anan says in the name of Rav, Ta'a v'lo hiskir shel Rosh Chodesh Arvis. What happens on Rosh Chodesh evening if I forget to say Ya'aleh v'yavo in mariv at night? Says the Gemara, Ein machzirinoto, I don't have to repeat Shmona Esrei. This many of us are familiar with, that if on Rosh Chodesh you forget Ya'aleh v'yavo in Shacharis and Mincha, you should repeat Shmona Esrei. But if you forget it at night, you don't have to repeat Shmona Esrei. Says the Gemara, why? What's the difference between Shacharis and Mincha and Mariv? So if I were to ask you that question, what would you all say? It's optional. That's not what the Gemara says. What does the Gemara say? Why not? Lefi she'ein beitin mikadshnet hachodesh ela b'yom. Because Rosh Chodesh is all about what's called Kiddush HaChodesh, when they would sanctify the new moon. And that only took place during the day. It did not take place at night. All the Rishonim ask, wait a second. Why are you giving me a reason connected to Kiddush HaChodesh, to the sanctification of the moon? The very simple answer should be, why do I not need to repeat Shmona Esrei at night if I leave it out at Shacharis, at Mariv? Because I don't need to say Mariv to begin with. So the fact that the Gemara needs to bring another explanation connected to Kiddush HaChodesh implies that this Mariv would be obligatory. That's again another Gemara that seems to indicate. And now a third Gemara. This Gemara is discussing a different scenario. This Gemara is discussing the halacha that a person is not allowed to involve, or it's discussing really two separate issues. But we're talking about that a person who is when the time to daven mincha comes, a person is halachically obligated to start davening right away. Right? Generally, when the time comes, you should start davening. You shouldn't wait, unless you're involved in certain activities. And the Gemara says, if you begin those activities before the Zman for Tefillah comes, you can continue those activities. But if you haven't started the activities yet, you should daven first and then begin those activities. Now, for us, this actually halacha is less practical, because now that we have set times for our minyanim, we're less worried about forgetting to daven. But back in the times of the Gemara, if a person didn't daven right away when the time came, we were afraid he would forget. And therefore, there were limitations to what you could do before you davened. So the Gemara says, if you began certain activities, you can continue those activities. If you didn't begin yet, you should first daven and then do those activities. So then the Gemara goes, well, what's considered starting an activity? And the Gemara now goes through a number of different activities and defines what's considering the starting point for those activities. That's the Gemara in source number 5. So one activity is getting a haircut. That you shouldn't if you started getting a haircut, which used to take a lot longer, you started getting a haircut before Zman of Tefillah came, then you can continue to get that haircut. But if you hadn't started yet, you should daven mincha, or if the time for Mariv came, you should daven Mariv. Says the Gemara, what's defined? What's considered starting the haircut? Is it sitting in the chair? Is it when he starts to cut? So says the Gemara, me'ematai hatchalat hatisporet. When is it considered to be that you've begun the process of getting a haircut that you now do not need to stop in the middle to daven. Amar Rav Avin, Mishayaniach ma'fores shel safarin al birkav. When you put the handkerchief that the barber puts on you, that's the beginning of the process of getting a haircut. Okay. What about another activity was going to the bathhouse, which used to be a much longer activity when they would go to take a shower, and it was a much bigger process. When is that considered to be that you started the activity? Amar Rav Avin, when you start to take off your kerchief, they used to wear some kind of outer kerchief on themselves. When you start taking off your clothing, the first piece of clothing that you take off, that is considered the beginning of the process of you've already started going to the bathhouse, and you can continue that in daven afterwards. Ume'ematai hatchalat borski. Borski is doing the act of tanning certain animals. When does that process begin? Mishayikshor bein kitefav. When you tie certain things between the shoulders of the animal. Again, we're not going to get into all of the details. One other activity, which is really more relevant for us right now, is another activity that you're allowed to continue if you started, is when you start eating. If you began a meal before this man tefillah came, you can continue that meal and finish it and then daven. If you didn't start the meal yet, you should daven first and then continue and then begin your meal. What's considered to be beginning the meal? So the Gemara gives two explanations. Rav Amar, Mishe Yitol Yadav. Once you wash your hands, you've now begun the meal, and you don't need to interrupt it if Zman Tefillah comes. Rav Chanina Amar, Mishe Yatir Chagura. Once you start to take off your belt or open up your belt in order to be able to make room for the food. Okay, and then the Gemara goes on and says, "Well, these are they're not the low pligi. There's no argument here. Halan v'halahu. These were different places. One was in Bavel, one was somewhere else. In different places, there were different actions that were done to indicate that I am now beginning my meal." Okay, that's all the background. Amar Abaye, comes Abaye and he says, "Hani chevrin bevavlai." All my friends from Bavlai. Leman de Amar Tefilat Arvit Reshut. According to those who say that Arvis is going to be Reshut, Kevan de Sharale Hemyane. Once he opens up or loosens his belt, Lo Matrichin Anle. When it comes to Mariv, it's going to be different than Mincha. Mariv, once you open up your belt, once you loosen your belt, that's the best way to say it. Once you loosen your belt, you've now started the meal and you don't need to stop and interrupt to go daven Mariv. Says the Gemara, wait a second, why are you talking about Mariv? We just said that that's true about Mincha as well, right? We just said a second ago that once you start your meal, whether it's Mariv or Mincha, it doesn't really matter. In both cases, you've begun your meal and you no longer need to interrupt your meal in order to daven. Ulamanda avar chova, says the Gemara Matrichin and Layit. If you hold Mariv is obligatory, you would make him tighten his belt and go daven. Va Tefilat Mincha dilakule alma chovahi utnan im hitchilu ein mafsikin. Well, Mincha, which we know is obligatory, and we already said that if a person loosens his belt, he no longer has to stop the meal. He can continue the meal. So the Gemara then goes on to distinguish between Mincha and Mariv. What the Gemara says is, number one, at night, there's more of a chance that at night, people used to drink alcohol as part of their meal. And if we have them start the meal, there's more of a concern that they might forget to daven. And therefore, only because Mariv is optional, therefore, we'll be more lenient that even once he begins the meal, he can continue it. Mincha, we're not worried that he's going to drink. And because we're not worried that he's going to drink, we'll be more lenient and let him continue the meal, even if he hasn't, even though once he begins the meal. So again, forgive me, it's a little bit of a confusing Gemara. What we see from this case is the Gemara seems to indicate that when it comes to Mariv, when do you not have to daven Mariv? Once you've begun the process of eating. All the Rishonim say, wait a second. Let's say I didn't begin the process of eating, and the time for Mariv comes, but I don't want to daven Mariv. Why not? Because Mariv is optional. Why does the Gemara seem to indicate that the only reason you can do this if Mariv is Reshut is because you've begun eating? Let's say I didn't begin eating. If I didn't begin eating, but you just told me Mariv is Reshut, Mariv is optional. And if Mariv is optional, I should be allowed to determine whether or not I want to daven Mariv. And here the Gemara seems to say that if it's optional, only if you began the meal do you not need to stop to daven Mariv. So this again seems to indicate that even when we say it's Reshut, clearly it must have some kind of obligatory piece to it. Okay? So we have a number of Gemaras. We have really three Gemaras, and there's more. Three Gemaras that all seem to clearly indicate that Mariv is obligatory. It's not optional. So how do we understand those who say it's optional? Not only that, as we said before, the simple understanding of the Gemara back then was that we paskin that it's optional. How do we understand these Gemaras? How do you put these two together? So, one other Gemara, and this is also important for us. One final Gemara that is important is a Gemara that we're familiar with, a Gemara that we've done a number of times, and that Gemara is source number 6, where the Gemara discusses the source for 3 times a day. And the Gemara says there's 2 sources for davening 3 times a day. Itmar, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina Amar, Tefilot Avot Tiknum. One opinion is that the Avot, our forefathers were the ones who established the Tefillah, the 3 Tefillot. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Amar, Tefilot Kineged Tmidim Tiknum. That they correspond to the Korbanot. So some of the Rishonim say, wait a second. If Tefillot come from the Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, okay, is there any reason to indicate, is there any difference between Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Are they all the Avot? Are they all legitimate Avot from what we understand? So then if each of the Avot established a different tefillah, so then why would anybody say Marav is Rishut? It doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. Because why would Marav be Rishut? Why is Yaakov's tefillah any less than all the other, than Avram and Yitzchak? So this Gemara also seems to indicate that tefillot, that Marav should be chovah. Okay, so this Gemara we can actually get out of easily. Okay, excellent. So therefore, there's 2 ways that we could say that we could answer the question from this specific Gemara. One answer we could give is exactly what you're suggesting, which is the Pnei Yoshua. The Pnei Yoshua in source number 7, he basically says, you're right. This Gemara about whether we learn tefillot from the Avot or we learn the davening from the Korbanot, that is the same machlokes of whether Mariv is Rishut or Chovah. If you learn the tefillot from the Avot, then what would you conclude? That Mariv is going to be obligatory, just like the other ones. If you believe the source for davening the 3 times a day is from the Korbanot, then it makes much more sense to say that Mariv is going to be optional, because we only have 2 main tmidim, we only have 2 main Korbanot, and the third one is corresponding the burning of the limbs of the animals, but that wasn't an actual korban. So says the Pnei Yoshua in source number 7, Lichora Nira, it seems to be, says the Pnei Yoshua, Dehach plukta talya beplukta detanai, that this machlokes regarding whether or not Mariv is Rishut or is Chovah will depend on the machloket whether we learn 3 times a day from the Avot or we learn it from the Korbanot. In which case, it's the same machloket. You have one machloket there, you have the same machloket here. They're dependent on each other. In which case, it's not really a question because you have 2 different opinions. You have, just like you had 2 opinions there, chovah, obligatory and optional. Here too, the 2 different sources for tefillah can correspond to those 2 opinions. Another way we could answer the question from this specific Gemara is we could say, well, as we said before, this Gemara regarding the Avot and regarding the Korbanot, some people say that this isn't a Gemara arguing over the source of davening 3 times a day. This Gemara is just meant to highlight where the tefillot could come from, that there's themes that come from the Avot, and there's themes that come from the Korbanot. It's not meant to be the main source, in which case it wouldn't really be a question because it's not dealing with the actual source for davening, for davening 3 times a day. So this Gemara, we could suggest, is not necessarily such a big question, but we still have 3 Gemaras that are a question. 3 Gemaras that all seem to indicate that Mariv is Chovah, is obligatory, and yet we concluded with our first Gemara that davening Mariv was optional. So the Rishonim discuss this in detail, and there are 3 main approaches. 3 main approaches that we can suggest. One approach, source number 8, comes from the Shita Mikubetzet. The Shita Mikubetzet is a likut, is a collection of Rishonim on the Gemara, and he explains the following. The Shita Mikubetzet basically, we'll skip the Shita Mikubetzet for now. We're going to go to the Sefer Halachot Gedolot. Excuse me. Sefer Halachot Gedolot in source number 8 makes the following declaration. He says, even though the tefillot started out as reshut, when we say reshut, what that basically means was it was optional. But if a person were to ever start to daven by himself, choose to do it, after doing it once or twice, he now has basically committed to doing it, and it now became a personal obligation. Okay, look at the Bahag in source number 8, the underlined part. Ki amrinan. The Tefilat Arvit Rishut. When we say Mariv is Rishut, Hani Mili Hecha Delo Kabai Litzluye Klal. That referred to a person who has never davened Mariv. It's optional, And if you choose never to daven Mariv, you basically keep it optional for you. Aval, eat sali o kibla ale. If you start to daven Mariv, or in your mind you accept upon yourself that you're going to daven Mariv, shavya ale kechova. It now becomes an obligation. Once you start doing it, you've now tapped in and basically said, I would like to adopt this, and now it's become chova. So all those Gemaras, says the Bahag, that seem to imply that you have to repeat if you forgot Rosh Chodesh, that you have to repeat if you forgot to daven, you have to do Tashlumin. All of those cases were in a situation where this person had already davened Mariv a couple of times and had therefore activated the obligation on himself. And that's why he was obligated to repeat Shmon Esrei if he forgot Yalav Yavo, or do Tashlumin if he forgot Arvit. It started out as a reshut, and it is now something that if the person chooses to do, he now has accepted upon himself as an obligation. Okay, now according to the Bahag, it seems to be a personal decision. Okay, meaning every person can decide for themselves. One person could choose to never daven, and then he would never have the obligation. Other people could choose to, once they start davening, it now becomes an obligation for them. That's one direction to go. Tosfos, in source number 9, has a totally different understanding. Tosfos says, the word reshut, optional, can have many different meanings. Optional could mean it is totally optional under all circumstances. Optional or reshut could also mean if you have any reason not to do it, it becomes optional, but other than that, you're obligated. Says Tosfos in source number 9. Halacha kedivrei omer reshut. Lav dafka reshut. Reshut doesn't mean here, when the Gemara says, even the opinion that says it's optional, doesn't mean it's optional in the sense like you can if you want to, you don't have to if you don't want to. What it means, ela kedepreciate. What it means is that lekach nikra reshut livatla avor mitzvah acheret. What it means is if you have a good reason not to do it, then if you had to pick one, then you can forego Mariv. But all things being equal, if you have no reason not to do Mariv, you're obligated to daven Mariv. Okay? So this opinion totally changes the concept of reshut. Reshut doesn't mean whatever you want. Up to you. If you want to, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. What it means is this is less of an obligation than Shacharis and Mincha. But if you don't have any other reason not to, you should do it. Good question. What he seems to suggest is, as he uses a language of avor mitzvah acheret. You have another mitzvah that needs to get done. And by the way, you're right. In all the other cases, he's going to need to explain, and this opinion Tosfos appears in a number of different places. And what he basically suggests is he usually refers to it as if you have a mitzvah to do or something similar to a mitzvah. But you are correct that it's going to be, you have to really define what that means. The seeming understanding is it means if you have something else of spiritual importance that you need to do, you can forego Mariv, but otherwise you should daven Mariv. And look at the next. I brought Tosfos again in source number 10 because there he fleshes out this opinion a little bit more. Okay, and again, first he opens up in source number 10 with all the questions from the Gemaras we brought that seem to imply that it's an obligation. And look at the underlined part in source number 10. V'omer ri nihi dereshuti, even though it is not the formal obligation like Shachrit and Mincha, in levatla v'chinam. You should not forego it for no reason. Imlo mipnei shum mitzvah overet, if not for the fact that either you have a mitzvah which you need to do, or shara hemyane, or you started your meal. Again, so he considers that also to be an important value. So again, you're right that there has to be this kind of definition of what's considered a good reason. So he has to toe that line. Then he continues and says the following. He says, I'll tell you why it has to be that it's somewhat of an obligation. Teda, kevan de Yaakov Avinu tikna. Because as we said earlier, if Yaakov Avinu established this, there's no reason to suggest that it's not going to be some level of obligation. Lo tikna levatala. If Yaakov established it, he didn't just establish it for kind of whoever wants to when they want to. It must have some level of obligation. The od kevan de keneged evarim upidarim. Since we also saw that Mariv corresponds to the burning of the parts of the animal, shema alanu maktiran kol halayla nihi delo ma'akve kapara. Mitzvah lahaktir. Even though the burning is not something you have to do, it is certainly a mitzvah to do. So the same thing should be here with Mariv. Mariv is, the status of Mariv, says Tosfos, is you should do it. It's an obligation unless you have a good reason not to. It's not as obligatory as Mincha, Shachrit and Mincha, but it certainly is an obligation. Okay? Now that will explain, if you understand it that way, that explains all the Gemaras. All those Gemaras that said you need to repeat if you forgot Yalav Yavo, or you need to make up Mariv if you didn't daven one time. That's because it really is fundamentally an obligation. Those are cases where you didn't have a good reason not to do it, and therefore you should have davened. And if you don't, you need to make it up. Okay, so that's explanation number 2. Explanation number 1 was that it is a full-fledged reshut. It is fully optional unless you started to daven yourself. Once you started to daven, then you need to continue. And the second is that when we said optional, we didn't really mean optional. We meant somewhat optional. There's more leeway with Mariv than there are with the other tefillot. The third opinion is the opinion of the Rif in source number 11. Source number 11, he says the following. First, he quotes the opinion of the Bahag, is the first part, which we did already. And then at the end, he says the following. Look at the end, the second underlined part, the end of source number 11. Afilu liman de amar reshut. Even those who say that Mariv is a reshut, chova hu deleta aval mitzvah ita. There's no obligation, but you do get a mitzvah for doing it. This is a little bit different than what we just said in Tosfot. Tosfot said there is an obligation unless you have a good reason. The Rif is saying you have no obligation. You don't have to, but if you do it, you get credit for it. There's mitzvah. There's something laudatory about doing it. Okay? And therefore, it's kind of like a middle ground. It's not that it's fully optional, and it's not that it's totally obligatory. It's in between. If you do it, you get credit for doing it. You should do it. It's a good thing to do. But you're not obligated to do it. And then the Rif ends with the most relevant part for us practically. V'ha'idna, nowadays, says the Rif, nohug alma l'shavye kechova. Says the Rif, nowadays, we as a community, and this may be something that you have heard before, we as a community have accepted upon ourselves to daven Mariv. And once we accepted upon ourselves to daven Mariv, it now becomes a chova. Okay, now this is different than the Bahag. The Bahag was talking about individuals who choose to daven. Once an individual chooses to daven, he then has an obligation. The Rif is talking communally. The Rif is basically saying, at some point during the time since the Gemara, the community itself made the decision to accept upon themselves to daven Mariv. And once that happened, we no longer have a choice. We no longer have a choice. We now, as a community, Mariv is now obligatory, and therefore we as a community must daven Mariv. Okay? So that also, different ways to explain the different Gemaras. And by the way, that is the way that we generally assume. Halacha lemaisa, and we're going to see now the Rambam. Halacha lemaisa, we practically assume that because as a community we accepted upon ourselves to daven Mariv, it is now considered to be obligatory. Now, when it comes to, for example, women in davening, and hopefully we'll get to that in a future class, because fundamentally women, it's a debate whether women are obligated and how much they're obligated. So for Mariv, we'll go back to saying that it's a reshut, and generally it's understood that women are not obligated to daven Mariv, whereas men are considered to be obligated to daven Mariv, although obviously a woman is certainly welcome and encouraged to. But in terms of obligation, it's less of an obligation than it is for men, even though the community accepted it. Yes, well, the reason is because since as a community we've now accepted it upon ourselves, therefore it's like it's obligatory, and that's why you have to repeat it if you forget it. I actually wasn't being 100% accurate when it comes to. And thank you for pointing this out. I just realized I want to make sure I'm clear. When it comes to Rosh Chodesh, you don't have to repeat it in Mariv, but the reason is only because of the reason connected to Kiddush HaChodesh, not because Mariv is optional. So it actually is true that if you, this is actually important. This is a distinction difference between Chol HaMoed and Rosh Chodesh. On Chol HaMoed, if you forget Yalav Yavo and Mariv, you repeat it. Why? Because again, we've accepted upon ourselves as an obligation. Rosh Chodesh, you don't, and that's unique to Rosh Chodesh because Rosh Chodesh is connected to Kiddush HaChodesh, the sanctification of the moon, which was only done during the day and not at night. Or if a person doesn't daven Mariv for some reason, he does have to do tashlumin and make it up the next day at Shacharit, because again, we've now as a community accepted Mariv as something that we daven together as a community. We've accepted upon ourselves, and we are now. It's now considered an obligation. Yes. Correct. Not like the Nitzanim community verse. Yes, correct. The Rif statement was a communal. By communal, I mean a big B'nai Klal Yisrael wide acceptance of davening Mariv. Now, the Rambam also agrees with the Rif, and that's why again he's also quoting the Rif, but he has a very interesting twist, which is picked up on by Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. And I want to first read the Rambam with you together. The Rambam in source number 12. Again, discusses the source for Mariv, and he's discussing actually the source for all of the Tefillot, and then he continues with Mariv. Source number 12. V'chein hitkinu Chazal established, Sheyehe Adam mitpalel tefillah achat balayla. You should daven one tefillah at night. Shaharei why? Shaharei evarei hatamid, the limbs of the korban tamid shel ben harbayim mitaklin veholchim kol alei. They would be burnt and consumed throughout the night. Shene'emar hi ha'olah v'chulei. Okay, and therefore corresponding to that burning of the limbs, we daven Mariv. And then he notes that there's also a hint to davening Mariv, as we've mentioned, from David HaMelech. Ki'inyan shene'emar, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, Erev vavoker v'tzaharayim asicha ve'eheme v'yishma koli. That I will talk to Hashem, and He will listen to my voice. That hints to the fact that we daven 3 times a day, as we've noted, because it mentions Erev, Boker, and Zaharayim. Then the Rambam continues. Ve'ein tfilat arvit chova ki tfilat shacharit u'mincha. The obligation to daven Mariv is not the same obligation as Mincha and Shacharit. V'afal pikein, nevertheless, nahagu kol Yisrael. The kol mikamon, that answers your question, right? All of Am Yisrael, wherever you are, moshvotehem lehitpalel arvit, to daven Mariv, v'kiblua aleihem ki tfilat chova. They accept it upon themselves as if it were to be an obligatory davening. Now, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik is known as Rav Chaim Brisker. He was one of the great halachic and Gemara minds in Jewish history. He's the grandfather of, as Rav Soloveitchik, and he began what's known as the Brisker method. And he has a whole number of different works. Mostly of them are on the Rambam. He notes that there seems to be a contradiction between this Rambam and another Rambam. I didn't bring you the other Rambam, but I'll mention it to you. The other Rambam mentions what happens if a person is davening Shemona Esrei. He's in the middle of Shemona Esrei, and this is, I have to say, admittedly, it happened to me. I imagine many of you will probably relate to this. I'm davening Mariv, and then all of a sudden I'm wait a second. I already davened Mariv. This is the second time that I'm davening Shemona Esrei for Mariv. I daven earlier than I usually do, or this, or that, right? I'm sure it's happened. The question is, what do you do then? So says the Rambam, and this is based off of the Gemara, that if it's Shacharit and Mincha, you should stop where you are. You shouldn't continue. Why? Because the Shemona Esrei that you thought you were saying, which was for Shacharit and Mincha, that is a Tefilat Chova. That is an obligatory davening. The only way you're allowed to daven if you don't need to is what's called a Tefilat Nidava, is if you're bringing an optional Tefilah to a Kadosh Baruch Hu, which a person can do whenever they want to. But says the Rambam, you can't start out having a Tefilat Chova and then finish it up as a Tefilat Nidava. It needs to be one or the other. And therefore, if you started in Mincha and Mariv, Shachar and Mincha as a Tefilat, because you thought it was Chova, because you thought you needed to daven, and then you realize, wait a second, I already daven Mincha, or I already daven Shacharit, you should stop in the middle and just don't continue, because you can't transition in the middle of the same Shemona Esrei from a Shemona Esrei that is Chova, that is obligatory, to one that is Nidava, one that is optional. But then says the Rambam, however, Mariv is different. If you're in the middle of Mariv, Shemona Esrei, and then you realize, wait a second, I davened already, you can continue and finish the Shemona Esrei. Why, says the Rambam? Because Mariv is optional. Says Reb Chaim. I don't understand. Look at the Rambam we just said. The Rambam we just said before said that Mariv, we've accepted upon ourselves that Mariv is not optional, that Mariv is obligatory. So how can this Rambam, not that much later, a few prakim later, talk about Mariv being optional and therefore you can continue your Shemona Esrei? Says Reb Chaim something very, very sharp. Says Reb Chaim, there's 2 different things we have to ask ourselves. One is, why am I davening this tefillah? And what is the type of tefillah that I'm davening? Says Reb Chaim the following. When according to the Rambam at least, he says this isn't true of everybody. When Am Yisrael accepted upon themselves to daven Mariv, the obligation was to say Mariv. But the actual tefillah that we're agreeing to say retains its initial status as a Tefilat Nidava. We're basically obligating ourselves to say an optional tefillah. Okay, it's a little bit of a fine distinction. We have committed ourselves to say it. That is what we agreed to accept. But the actual tefillah itself retains its status as an optional davening, which means the type of tefillah that we're davening as Tefilat Mariv is going to be fundamentally different than Shacharit and Mincha, even though we say all of them practically. Okay, now what does that mean? What that means is, in terms of practically, it means the type of tefillah, the nature of that tefillah is going to be a little bit different. We are obligating ourselves to say something that is optional. Shacharit and Mincha, it's what's called a Tefilat Chova. That is a Tefilat Chova. Mariv, we agreed to say it. We obligated ourselves to say it, but it still retains the flavor of an optional. Now, again, what's better, what's worse, optional or obligatory? What do you think? You can go both ways, right? If something is obligatory, so I'm fulfilling something I need to do, I'm listening to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to do. If something is optional, it has a certain personal element to it, has a different style, a different flavor to the tefillah. So what the Jewish people committed to doing when they agreed to daven Mariv was they obligated themselves to say a tefillah that still retains its optional type. It's a different style. And therefore, says Reb Chaim, if you're in the middle of Shmona Esrei for Shacharis and Mincha, and you realize you davened already, you have to stop because you're in the middle of, you started as a chovah, you can't transition to a nidava. What about Mariv? Mariv, we all have to say. And then I'm in the middle of davening, and I realize, wait a second, I davened already. I'm still only davening what he calls a Tefilat nidava. And therefore, I can complete that davening, according to the Rambam, even though I don't need to say it, because anyway, the Tefilah was started as a Tefilat nidava. Okay, it's a beautiful idea. And the Rambam and Reb Chaim suggest, again, it's very fine. That is what we would call a classic Brisker distinction in terms of understanding that it's not just about why you're davening. It's what there's the distinction between why you're davening and what you're saying. And there's a lot there that we could unpack. But I just wanted to share with you that overall approach, which that even according to Reb Chaim, even once we've agreed to daven Mariv and to obligate ourselves to daven Mariv, the flavor of that tefillah is going to still remain different. And that I think is important because it's important that when we recognize that our different tefillot have come to highlight different types of themes. And here Reb Chaim is highlighting that this is a tefillah which we're obligated to say, but the style of it and the flavor of it is going to be a little bit different than mincha and shacharit.
Continue that. For example, women who are not obligated to daven but decide to daven.
So again, we're the whole world of.
They're in the middle of the tefillah.
You mean that specific point? No. So again, the truth is that the whole issue of are women obligated to daven or not is a totally different conversation, and it's not so clear that they're not obligated. According to many opinions, they are obligated to daven. It's just a question of how many times, and I do hope that we'll get to cover it. But most opinions are that women are obligated to at least daven once a day. And there's different distinctions as to why that would be. Is it because it's not a mitzvah d'sheishes zman grama, or it is a mitzvah d'sheishes zman grama? Maybe even though it is zman grama, they're still obligated anyway. It's a whole conversation. It's a fascinating conversation. The simple understanding is that women are obligated to daven at least once a day. Some even say twice a day. So therefore, it's a whole separate discussion. But you are correct about that. It would highlight. It would connect to that whole conversation. I think again, Mariv certainly they're not obligated to do. That pretty much everybody agrees, although it's definitely women who want to accept upon themselves to do that. It's certainly laudatory. Okay, so there's one other thing that I wanted to just mention. So in terms of just two points I wanted to mention to conclude. Lemaisa, as I said, we follow what the Rif and the Rambam say, which is that we believe that nowadays we are obligated, certainly the men are obligated to daven Mariv because we accepted upon ourselves to daven Mariv. I brought for you in source number 14, they point out, we're not going to do it inside, but the reason why there is no Chazarat HaShatz, right? We have Chazarat HaShatz, Shachrit and Mincha. Why is there no Chazarat HaShatz at Mariv? Because even though we've accepted upon ourselves to daven now, fundamentally it started out as a Tefilat Reshut, and therefore they weren't Toreach Litzibur to have Chazarat HaShatz. They made it a smaller and quicker Tefillah. But there's one other point that I wanted to share with you, which I just found recently, which I thought was fascinating. There is actually, if you look at source number 15, the Sharei Tshuva, which is a commentary. This isn't the Sharei Tshuva, the famous Sharei Tshuva of Rabbeinu Yonah about a treatise on Tshuva. This is a halachic sefer that is a commentary to the Mishnah Berurah. In source number 15, he quotes an opinion that says that even if you hold that Mariv is a reshut, Mariv on Friday night is going to be different. Mariv Friday night is obligatory. This is the opinion of the Ktsiya. Mor u'Ktsiya, source number 15. Uvemor u'Ktsiya katav the Tefilat Arvit Shabbat v'Yom Tov Chova. That even if you hold that during the week davening Mariv is a reshut, everybody agrees. This is an opinion that's also mentioned apparently in the Zohar. I don't really learn Zohar, not yet at least. But apparently the Zohar holds that davening Mariv on Friday night is obligatory. The question would be, why would there be a difference between Friday night / or Yom Tov night and the rest of the week? No, not for women. We're talking now. Actually, you know what? I don't know, but I believe we're talking only specifically about men. Okay, so the question would be why? So in order to fully understand this, there is a fascinating explanation of Rav Tzadok Milublin, who tries to explain why to begin with Marav would ever be, what's the depth of this idea, a deeper understanding of this idea that Marav is Reshut as opposed to the first two Tefillot that are Chova. And Rav Tzadok in source number 16 gives the following explanation. Ulekach Tefilat Arvit Reshut. Why is Tefilat Arvit Reshut? Ki Tefilah hu hakarat hanochach yoter mikriyat shema kmo shekasavti lael ve'i efshar lechayev balayla. He says, what is Tefilah all about? Tefilah is about achieving a certain awareness of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. And says Rav Tzadok, there's a fundamental difference when it comes to awareness of a Kadosh Baruch Hu between daytime and nighttime. Daytime represents, as we know in many different ways, in many different areas, daytime represents clarity, represents an ability to see things as they are. Nighttime, in the world of machshava, represents darkness, when things are less clear. Things I don't feel the presence. That's why we say lahagid baboker chasdecha ve'emunatcha baleilot. In the boker, lahagid, I can talk about God's kindness. At night, I can't talk about God's kindness because it's harder for me to see Him. What do I need to rely on? My emunah, my faith. So says Rav Tzadok here, davening for encouraging or making it obligatory for a person to daven shacharit and mincha, that makes sense. Why? Because daytime represents times of clarity where it's easier for us to see God in our lives. Nighttime represents moments where we don't see God as clearly. To obligate somebody to daven at moments when it's harder for them to see the presence of God, you can't do that. It's not right. It's all based on how much a person is able to see. And therefore, says Rav Tzadok, symbolically, Chazal instituted Shacharit and Mincha as being obligatory, and Arvit as being Reshut, because Arvis represents those moments when a person has trouble seeing God or seeing the Yad Hashem. It's much harder for a person to connect, and therefore, fundamentally, Arvis is Reshut. Now getting back to Shabbos. I heard this in a podcast that I heard a few weeks ago from Rabbi Yossi Zakutinsky, who's a very, very well-known and popular rabbi in the five towns. He said, based on this Rav Tzadok, perhaps we can now explain the Zohar. Why would Shabbos be different? Because Shabbos is a time when we're meant to see the bigger picture. Shabbos is a time where we commemorate that God created the world. God created the world in 6 days. And we hope, we're striving to achieve a greater level of understanding that everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's when we're hopefully able to see the bigger picture. It's why we say what tefillah do we say on Shabbos? Tov lehodot laHashem u'lezamer l'Shem chal yom. Again, we talk about Mizmor Shli Shabbat. It's when we're supposed to see God, or hopefully strive to see God's presence, even in moments that are darker. Shabbos is meant to help inspire that, and therefore it's specifically on Shabbos, suggests Rabbi Zakutinsky, that maybe based on this Rav Tzadok, that's when Chazal would obligate one to daven Mariv even at night, because Shabbos gives someone the strength and the ability, or strives to give us the strength and the ability to see God's hand even in moments of darkness, and that is the gift of Shabbos on some level, and therefore Chazal obligated one to daven Mariv on Mariv on Shabbos, even if during the week they made it optional and no longer obligatory. Okay, so that was just one thing at the end. So what we saw today was we discussed the status of Tefilat Arvit. We noted a machlokes in the Gemara whether davening Mariv is optional or obligatory. Big machlokes starting from the Tanaim to the Amoraim down to the Rishonim. We noted that there seems to be a contradiction between the different Gemaras. One Gemara seems to make it clearly that it's Reshut, but other Gemaras seem to clearly indicate that it is obligatory. We noted a few different ways to interpret what that means. What does Reshut really mean? Does Reshut mean it's totally optional? Or if you accept upon yourself, then maybe it becomes obligatory. Or maybe Reshut just meant if you have no reason, if you have a good reason, then you don't have to do it. Or maybe it meant that the entire community accepted upon themselves. It was Reshut, and then the community as a whole accepted upon themselves to daven. And that is how we paskin. We paskin that we as a community have accepted upon ourselves to daven Mariv, and therefore we are obligated all to daven Mariv. We saw that beautiful idea of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, that even though we've accepted upon ourselves to daven, the nature of that tefillah still retains its flavor of being one of option, and therefore it has a status of being a tefillat nidava, and it's worth thinking about what exactly that means and how that can add more meaning to our tefillah. And then we ended with this idea that perhaps the significance of making Mariv optional corresponds to the difference between night and day, the difference between moments of clarity versus moments of doubt, and that Chazal can encourage us, obligate us to daven during moments of clarity, whereas moments of doubt, night represented by night, Chazal couldn't make that obligatory, except perhaps maybe on Shabbos, because on Shabbos we get that boost of inspiration. Wishing everybody a wonderful, wonderful week.